We good? Yep, perfect. Okay. So anyways, Hans Schmidt, member of our church, veteran, someone who is bold, willing to go out, preach the gospel on the streets, which very few are willing to do, and often other Christians will mock you for that, oh, this never gets across to anyone. Who is actually going to be persuaded by street preaching? You just look crazy, you just look like this. But it was something that he continually did, despite mockery, despite getting verbally harassed, despite all of these things. But eventually, greater action was taken against him. I just want to show you what he looks like. Just a solid man right there. Like you can just tell by looking at him. Looks like a great guy. But somebody, when he was preaching 2 years back, decided that they were going to silence him from doing that, and they were going to do it forever. And he was shot in the back of the head by someone for street preaching out in Arizona. And just to give you a little bit of the story, like he had no idea what was going on. He somehow, like by the grace of God, he maintained consciousness. He was able to drive his car after getting shot, got help, and after months of recovery, he lived. But during this, very shortly after it happened, there was a lot of attention on this. Things die so quickly now where we just forget these things ever happened, where they can even slip from us, where this was a member of our fellowship who this happened to. But during the time when this happened, there were a lot of people that were praying for him, and I just want to share you one of the biggest people who talked for him was Charlie Kirk. And he said there was a 28-year-old preacher, Hans Schmidt. He was shot in the back of the head while standing on a corner in Glendale, Arizona, encouraging people to attend an evening service and hear the gospel at his church, Victory Chapel. He was a veteran with a wife, 2 children. He was clinging to life. And even before some coward pulled the trigger, he was getting shrieks, curses that whole time, but he did not leave through all of that. He did not decide to pack it up until someone came out and silenced him with a gun. And so all of that, he ends on a prayer, which was seen by millions and millions of people, who hundreds of thousands of people were able to pray for Hans because of the actions that he took, because he decided to take a little bit of time out of his day to just say, look at this action, look at what happened here, please pray for him. And everybody knows this already. Not too long ago, he himself was shot. And he was not, God decided that for whatever reason, for whatever his plan, while Hans Schmidt would miraculously recover, Charlie Kirk was taken. That doesn't mean that it was therefore, oh, he deserved to die, or any of these other things, like a lot of people are saying. It just means that because of the actions that he took, because of the things that he was doing, because Christians do get persecuted. We don't often see this as much in America, but it happens all over the world, that where you just simply by existing, by proclaiming the gospel, throughout, you can read the entire history of the church for 300 years was almost nothing but being persecuted either by Pharisees or by the Romans later. And it's a consistent thing that happens to Christians when they are faithful. And now you can disagree with some of the things that he had. A lot of people had issues with some of the things that he did or how he acted or any number of things. At the end of the day, one of the things that he said shortly before he died in an interview was, what would you want to be remembered for if you were taken from us? And his answer, flat out, first thing was, I want to be remembered as a man of faith. Consistently, if you saw him as he grew, he cared more and more about faith as he came on. And you can disagree with his politics or his other things, but you can at least recognize that regardless of that, he was a man who did deeply care about God, and he was likely killed in part for that stand. And so I just wanted to get that across, because Hans Schmidt, after he was shot, and this was amazing, I was just reading the article just to make sure, but he said, I forgive the man who shot me in the head. And I'm sure Kirk's family, other people who are more deeply connected, they should also forgive the person who killed Charlie Kirk, because that is what we are called to do. But at the same time, what we can often miss as Christians is that forgiveness does not mean a total freedom of consequences for the actions that were taken. And that applies very widely. For example, pastor, sometimes you do get forgiveness. Pastor has an amazing story where he was a thief constantly breaking into places. He got caught in an undercover sting operation by police officers because when he was a young guy, he had a bunch of stolen pistols. They wrap him up. They could easily throw the book at him. He could be a felon after that. The judge decides forgiveness based off of that, and he decides, I'm going to give you total clemency for your actions. I see you as someone who could change, who can do these things, and so I'm going to give you that. And sometimes you do get that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are times where, despite the forgiveness that God gives you, despite the forgiveness that you have, despite forgiving others, sometimes there is still punishment that needs to come afterwards. There is still an earthly judgment that still occurs, and there's nothing wrong with that. And there's something that we can miss with that. At the same time, it's also that you, despite being saved, despite being a godly man, despite being a Christian, you will also receive consequences for the actions. And we are told over and over again that we receive consequences for our actions, even when those are righteous actions. You read here, blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And so you can receive negative things that happen to you even as you do good, just as Hans did. For going out and for preaching, for doing as we are commanded to spread the gospel, he was shot. It happens. It's happening more and more as we go. There are churches that get bomb threats. There are churches where insane people show up and decide to start killing children. That's just the reality that we're living in. And we had the grace of living in a much more Christian, much more peaceful nation for much of our time, but things seem like they might just continue to go down that line. It could get better, it could get worse, but that's something that we just have to realize and look at other churches and how they deal with these things. See what people around the world where they don't have the same kind of freedom, the same kind of peaceful society that we have, where they have to deal with active persecution, where you have churches in places like India where they will sometimes they just get bombed or attacked or the churches get destroyed. The same in the Middle East, the same in parts of Africa. There's a lot of places in the world where it is very unsafe to be a Christian. We are very blessed even now, even with these acts. It's still a handful of times. It's still things that it largely makes the news because it is a big deal. But it's happening more and more. It's basically undeniable. So be glad that you have what you have out of this, but just be ready, because even as we do take the stands we do, as we preach the gospel, as we are bold in our faith, things like this can happen. And likely it won't be as extreme, but it will be things like you potentially losing your job because you're sharing the gospel at work and because your boss doesn't appreciate it. Or you, while you're out trying to evangelize, dealing with someone who is just angry and irate and just berating you over it. And as you do more and more actions in your life, you will see more of these things happen as you do righteousness. And at the same time, going back to the idea of forgiveness, even as someone does wrong, that is something that we are supposed to hold to. And I just want to reiterate, that doesn't mean that now means you get no judgment. For example, let's say that the assassin who killed Kirk repents. He totally turns his life around for Jesus Christ. He's like, I'm a new man. I am redeemed. I am all for God. I did wickedness. I did wrong. That doesn't mean that you just totally commute his sentence right there. He still did wicked actions. And if you were to do that, you would now encourage everyone to, as soon as you killed someone, just pretend like you're Christian for a little bit, because a lot of people can be really good at pretending like they're Christians. I've done that for a lot of my time, convinced a lot of people that I was a good, faithful man when I wasn't. Now you would just incentivize doing that, and now you're out of your judgment, out of any consequences for the actions that you take. It obviously just cannot work like that. There are times where punishment, justice has to happen, and we see that in what is ordained for the government. The most clear role that the government has, that God lays out, is that he is a minister to you for good, but if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is God's minister, an avenger to execute with wrath on him who practices evil. That is the most clear outline of what the government is supposed to do. It also means that, for example, when you are angry, when you are wrathful, doing things like going out and I'm going to take justice into my own hands, law into my own hands, that's not something you're supposed to do. We leave that up to the government. We leave that up to God. Oftentimes we say things like vengeance is the Lord's, we repeat that, but we kind of just think that vengeance is the Lord means that like there's just going to be a random act of God that God eventually does, but God works through people. He works through different things. So in the ordained way that it is meant to be, where you allow the law, you allow the systems in place, you pray for them, you hope that they would do as they're supposed to do, and you rely on them to do it. And it's one of the most interesting things to me with this is like Paul is, when he wrote this, was writing about the Roman government, who would later execute him and kill him unrighteously. But he still said, leave these things up to that particular office and where that is meant to be. And so when you can feel anger when Christians are hurt, when you see things like Hans Schmidt get shot, when you see people that you know or people that are very public figures have things happen to them that should not have happened, it's very easy to slip into anger and wrath at that and want to do something about it that you're not necessarily meant to do. But you should leave these things to the order that they're meant to be and leave it up to God, but that doesn't mean that nothing then happens. For example, I just want to go over to this as just to finalize my point of how Christians understood this, where someone might have been redeemed, might have done something righteous, but there's still consequences to those actions that have to be taken in order to make sure that you have a just and flowing society, and they understood that. It's an executioner's sword from Germany with the inscription, "When I raise this sword, so I wish that this poor sinner will receive eternal life." I think that in a lot of ways that's a difficult thing for us to wrestle with now, but I think that that is the right way to do it. I mean, I'm sure Hans, if you asked him, do you forgive the guy who shot you? Yes. Do you think that therefore he should never go to jail for any of this? Probably not. I'm pretty sure, and there's nothing wrong with that, in the same way that if you do things that are so wicked that even God himself said to Noah, if those who take lives will have their lives taken from them after the flood, that is one of the parts that we often miss, is that that occurs after the flood, after the promise that I will never destroy the world again through water, through these floods. Also, you must carry out justice on these actions. That's part of it. We see that that is a part of God's order for how we are supposed to be. And so when we do forgive, when we do have these things, it's again, just understand that there is actions that happen to consequences. And it's really easy to apply this to criminals, to apply this to those who do wrong. It's very easy for me, honestly, to say that the guy who shot him should be executed and make myself in a way where I'm higher than him or above him in a lot of ways. But it applies to everyone here too in ways that we often don't realize, where in much smaller ways, the sins that you take, the actions that you take, even as you're forgiven for them, they still carry consequences that you then have to deal with. It's not just because you are forgiven, just because you have had these things. Sometimes the wrongdoing that happened in your life, it doesn't mean that all those things are going to go away. For example, and it's very clear, if you spent most of your life on heroin, you're going to have physical consequences to that. Now, you might be healed of it. It might come along, and you should pray for that, and you should help. But you have built pathways in your body that now make you more susceptible to it. You're a lot more likely to slip into it. You really can't take painkillers as much anymore because you're a lot more likely to slip back into that. It causes extreme damage to your body to do these things. And there's many other examples, alcohol, all these other things, or just straight up sexual immorality can warp your views in ways that seem unrecoverable sometimes. A lot of the things that we do, a lot of the sins that we do, have consequences to them that, yes, you can be delivered from. Yes, you can be healed from them. But not always. God does not heal every single person, always. And it's not a matter of them lacking faith. It's not a matter of them having, they just needed to pray harder. Sometimes you just aren't healed. Sometimes that is something that you are meant to carry in order to remind you of the consequences of your actions so that way you don't fall again. I just want to add this. Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows to his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And we can do both sometimes, and I think that's very clear to a lot of people, where you can still sin even after you're saved. You can still be sowing the flesh while you're sowing the Spirit at the same time. A lot of us just, I guarantee you, like most people in here have, I know for sure that I have sinned many times after being saved. And I have sowed the flesh and I have reaped consequences from it after being saved. That is just something that happens to us. And it's something that we have to deal with as Christians. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't love you, that these things are wrong. In fact, we go to Hebrews 12, 7 through 9. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we have paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? And so, if you're actually dealing with consequences from your inaction, from Hebrews 12, it seems very clear to me that actually means that you are a child of God, that you are saved, that you do, because you're actually experiencing God coming in and saying, slapping your hand and saying, no, stop reaching for that, stop going there, stop doing those things, even if it's painful, even if it hurts, even if you have to deal with long-term issues or broken relationships or things that just don't seem like they can be renewed because of your actions. That means that God actually cares and is treating you as a son of his. If you are without chastening, then you are illegitimate and not sons. If someone is actively sinning, actively living a terrible way, and there's nothing where God is actually intervening, it's because they have not come to him in forgiveness in the first place, and they are not sons and daughters of God in the first place. If you are receiving consequences of this, then God has redeemed you, but he is trying to sanctify you right now. And that's something that we often miss in the church as well, is not so much this one, but many, many churches. They think that you come up, you pray the sinner's prayer, and you're good. That's it. That's the end of the whole thing. That's the destination. You get saved, you're good. That's it. Nothing more after that. You're just perfect from then on out, and any mistakes you make are just you. But that's step one of the entirety of it. You are spending your entire life pursuing running a race. That is what Paul refers to it as. It's running the race, and the finish line happens when you're done with life. You are constantly being renewed. You are constantly coming back to greater faith. You are rooting out deeper sins that you didn't recognize in yourself for the longest time. You are actively working constantly with God in order to be a better son or daughter of him. And so, this chastening, if you do experience these consequences after sins, which, like, there's things that I have done years back that I still feel consequences for, that I still look at and can say, that's something that happened, and I can never get past that it just is what it is. If you look at, for example, David, when he lost his son after he slept with Bathsheba and got Uriah killed for it, God forgave him, and God decided, you are not going to die because of this, but I'm going to take your son back from you. And so even though David was a child of God, he was a man after God's own heart, he still failed, he still fell, and he had to deal with he would never get to see his son grow up. And that was something that would have stayed with him his entire life. He wasn't coming back because of the actions that he took. But that chastening, that consequence, even as difficult as it can be, shows love of God in the same way that a father deciding, you know what, son, I'm sorry, but you need to have a spanking, a timeout, or whatever you need, because you need to understand that this is wrong and you need to do better. That is what that chastening is. And to neglect completely is to not love, to not care. You don't spank a random child that you see out at the store, even when they're doing wrong, because it's not your child. And so, just understand that even as we deal with these things, even as we see the consequences in ourselves, we actually do look to those more, and we don't just say, oh, look at the wicked person, the evildoer, look at them getting what has come to them. But you look at yourself and you see, okay, these things that are happening to me, is this because of my own righteousness, my own stand for God, that is causing these things that is having these things occur? Because you will receive consequences for standing for God. But you'll also receive consequences as a Christian when you go against God. There's consequences on either way. You're always going to have pain or struggle or other things in life that occur. That is just life. It's not an easy, totally free, you're with Jesus, now it's all sugar plums and roses. Either way, whether you're doing wrong or good, you're going to have negative things happen. That's just how it is. And Scripture is very clear on that. You're going to have good things too. You're going to be blessed. You're going to have tons of things. I mean, the main thing is that you will have eternal life. And that's also why those consequences, those things that we can have happen, whether we're doing good, whether we're doing bad, that there are things that will happen to you that will hurt you. At the end of the day, your reward is infinitely greater than whatever you experience here. And at the same time, if someone is wicked and goes through and does not receive any chastening, and they never receive the consequences in their time here on earth, but they never repented, they never turned back to God, any of the benefits, any of the things that you saw on this earth that they received are nothing compared to what awaits them because of the choices that they made here in their own life of never turning from their sin. And so just understand that at the end of the day, whether these things happen to us or not, whether you receive a lot of persecution or whether you are blessed and you get to live peacefully, it is ultimately about the end of it. Are you with God? Are you without God? And I'd like us to bow our heads now as I take us forward. And I just want